Hi, I'm Mark Rutten. Welcome back to Nomad Boat Building.
One of the most common forms of building a boat involves using forms set up onto a building base, and those forms are referred to as station molds. Now, these station molds can be made in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes they can be permanent parts of the boat, sometimes they're just temporary. They're often made out of plywood or some other sheet goods, but I like using solid wood. So today I'm building Gannet. I'm going to share the method I use for building solid wood station molds that are applicable to just about any sort of boat building project.
So here's one of our molds. This is called a crossball. So that sits on our building base, and that's how we sort of align all the molds to each other. Then we got the molds themselves, and we have some gussets that connect the halves together. We're going to build out one or two of the next ones. Now the next ones we have got joints in the middle here, so we're going to start with those. My first step is getting out some pieces that are going to be long enough for my sections of mold. These molds I have to make up in two pieces just because of the size of the frames. So right now I'm working on number 7. I'm kind of putting this joint nominally over top of the leg. I don't really worry about what the miter is exactly. If I'm unsure, I'll set up two pieces spanning the joint. Then I'll run my circular saw across the top of one, with the blade just set a hair deeper than the first, and it'll mark the second. So that'll give me the angle that I need for both pieces. So my first step here is just to sort of give myself enough material that it's gonna cover. Yeah, that'll be good. So I need to bucket off here. I want to go just a little bit long by an inch or two. I'm just gonna mark where this miter is gonna go, right there with some tape. And then I'll mark off on the other end of this piece of stock what I need for length on this one. So roughly there. So I know my miter's got to go approximately there. Okay, so there's my first one I need for one leg. Put that to the side. And what I can do is I can just flip this around. Flush up those two cuts. Tack them together. Cut that out. There's one leg. Now the other one needs to be this long. I need to get another board. I'm going to do the same. Just drop this on the end of a long board and then recut that. So that's going to become my mold. Give myself a couple of registration marks. Now it helps to tack these together, and I like using these staples, except that they get in the way of the pattern, so we're not going to use those right now. The other option is just to use some staples. Okay, with those tacked together, now we get our pattern out. There's number 7 I was doing. So we'll just lay that on there. Just make sure that my bottom portion, where the strong back goes, is exposed. And it helps to leave enough material around the outside of my pattern to be able to put some nails. Don't need that. So I've got a bunch of awls. These are quite cheap and have proven to be quite handy. Can't remember what I paid for them, $2 or $3 a piece. So what I'm doing is I'm pinning this guy in a couple of spots, and I'm marking all of my pertinent bits of information. So there's a center line I've just marked to the end of my mold where my strong back is. Then I'll just start marking out where my features are. So I've got a stringer that runs through there, the inwale, marking out my laps. And lastly, we mark out where my keelson goes. Take a moment to think about where these marks are. And I pop this out of the way. And now I'm just throwing some finishing nails into the features that I need. So at the laps is primarily where I need some nails. So I'm going to bend a bundle batten around these to remark the line. Now I like using the pine because it's easy to work and I can get both sides of my mold out with one cut. Unlike if I were to work with plywood. Well, I mean, you could certainly do this with plywood too, but people tend to get a single mold out of one breadth of plywood. And one of the reasons I don't like doing that is because it uses up a hell of a lot of plywood. Now these awls come in handy again for just holding the bundle batten in place.
Now there's a reason I don't use the awls instead of finishing nails for this entire operation. First of all, I've got a hell of a lot more finishing nails than I do awls on hand, but more importantly, they don't control the shape of the bundle batten as well as the finishing nails do. The finishing nails aren't much bigger than the size of my pencil line, whereas the awls have a much larger diameter, and because they're tapered, they will tend to push the top of the batten off at a bit of a weird angle. Now they do a great job of just backing up the bundle batten, which is why I'm using them for that, and it saves me from having to fumble around with the hammer and nails for the whole thing. However, that is normally how I have done bundle battens in the past, and it's only because I now have these awls on hand that I'm doing it differently.
Now I need my other features marked. Got my center line here.
Now you'll notice I didn't pull all the finishing nails and awls out of the molds at this point. That's because some of those are giving me a good reference point from which I need to draw some straight lines. Now, the ones that I've left behind, other than that, is out of pure laziness. I'll get to them in a moment.
I'm just going to mark my laps here.
Our plans happen to show all of our plank widths at every mold. That's a real bonus, so we want to preserve that information, but more often than not, we have to figure that out later on in the process.
Now we just take these two parts apart and over to the bandsaw to cut these out.
I can't overstate the value of a bandsaw for wooden boat building. If you don't have one, go out and get one. For about $500 you can pick up a lower end new one or a decent quality used one. It doesn't matter what brand it is. The average size is 14 inch, that's the throat depth. You could get away with 12. You don't want to go smaller because usually the wheels are smaller and you can't put decent sized blades on them. I'd say the motor should be 3/4 horsepower at the minimum. You need to be able to put 1/2 inch blades on it. I use 1/2 inch 3 TPI blades for almost everything. This design features a laminated inwale construction. That means we need to build it in place and then bevel it to accept the planking. It's not a typical detail, but we're going to need a notch cut into the molds to accommodate this, and I got to think about how I'm going to get this off the molds later on in the process. Maybe after the inwales are laminated and shaped, I'll make some relief cuts into the molds so that I don't have a huge fight trying to get this boat off of the form when I'm done planking. Worst case scenario, I simply flip the hull over with the molds still in place, and then I chop them out of there. And these molds are going to have a notch that the keelson lets into, so I just want to check the width of it because the keelson's tapered, and so the notches are slightly different sizes.
Okay, and the last thing we're going to do is you need to carry these flap lines across to the other side. It's advantageous if you can cut right to the line when doing this. It saves you a lot of cleanup. We don't need these to be particularly smooth because it's lap strake. The planking itself will fair out the molds. So long as these marks are relatively good and they're symmetrical side to side, we should have no problem. All right, now it's time to assemble our molds. So I'm just going to start by laying out kind of a building jig here. So got a piece of plywood, we've got a cleat across the back. I've added some blocks on there so that this is going to be high enough to accommodate both the sections of mold and the what we call a crossball that goes across the bottom. All right, so before I start, I want to lay out sort of a building jig. So I'm going to take my pattern here, and it justifies up to this cleat at the bottom. I've cut it off right at the strong back line on my pattern. I'm just going to use some awls to tack it in place. So I'm just going to tack it along the center line primarily for now. Because this pattern is only half of a pattern, I need to take a few marks from this side and flip it over to the other side. I'm going to flip the pattern in a moment, but I'm going to mark off a few spots with awls on this side that I can use to justify the two halves together. So I'm just going to come to the outside here where the molds sort of run straight because it's a good registration point, and I'll hit them just maybe a 1/4 inch below where the shear mark is. Now there's a bunch of pinholes in this drawing already, so I need to make sure that I mark the ones in particular that I'm using. So I'm just going to duck in here with a pencil, mark them. All right, that's really all I need from those. So I can now flip this over, and I'll use the same holes that I used the first time along the center line here to justify this. Now the rest of this pattern can just stay right where it is. I don't need to move it. I need to get rid of one of these awls because it's going to be in my way, but otherwise it can stay put. And I can even use the same marks I used on the other side right here and just set them up right away. Okay, now I want to assemble my molds here. So let's just start with the first one. It's going to pop an awl in up here where I can register the mold against it easily. So that guy will go up there, and the other half goes here, and then we're just going to tack a gusset on. We're going to flip it over, put a gusset on the other side. Okay, once we're happy with our alignment, I'm just going to add some gussets to the side here. Okay, and then we carefully flip this over. We add a gusset to that side too. Okay, now we just simply butt them together here. Don't need these balls anymore because the centers will butt up. You just need the edges butting to their marks. Like so. That looks good. Like that. And we drop another gusset in the center. Okay, and then I grab a cross ball, and I'm just going to quickly lob it to length because I don't need it sticking out. Okay, so we just drop that on. It butts up against my blocks. Roughly equidistant on the ends, that's fine. Now this crossbar doesn't feel like it's quite straight enough. There, that's a bit better on that side. Now I've put these blocks nominally where my strong back arms are going to be, my strong back rails, and that means that every mold's going to be justified to these spots rather than worrying about these spots out here. Alright, now before I go away, I want to square up to the center line. So I've got a block here specifically for that. We're going to square all the way around, and when I set these up, this is my registration face right here. So I got to make sure I've got a center line on the back side of this cross ball. And there we go, we're done. A little arrow on there just to remind myself, because it's easy for me to get confused while I'm working and forget what my plan was. So there we go, that's one mold done. We move on to the next. So with each of these, I give myself a couple of balls to justify these molds to. Just makes it a bit easier. Especially because I can't really see very well. I'll put that into the drawing. Everything's away from my face. Do another one. Looks pretty good. This is why leaving them tacked together like this is really helpful, because it gets you through this little stage pretty fast. Okay, so one thing I don't do, which I should do, and I always kick myself later on, is it would be smart if I had some common cross ball sitting at least a fixed distance down from the center that I can attach a temporary cleat to tie them all together when they're on the mold. I always forget to do it, and this time is no exception. Oh, darn it. I forgot to do something important on this one. I did not carry my plank marks over, so I'm going to have to do that after the fact.
Forgetting to put these plank lines on is certainly an annoyance, but because I use these mylar patterns, it is really just a minor annoyance. So I can just lay the pattern right on the mold, prick through where my plank laps are, then we're back on track.
Okay, now there's one thing I screwed up, and this is just stupidity on my part. You'll notice on this mold we have flats here around the turn of the bilge. Okay, the reason this one has flats around the turn of the bilge is because the plans described planks wrapped around the mold. Okay, so take a look at the drawings here. So these are our molds, each of these guys here, and also these ones. We'll look at this one in particular. You can see how it's describing each plank lapping onto the next. On this particular mold, you can see this area that I'm sketching in blue. This is showing where the plank is crossing over the mold. So what that means is, on this particular mold, in order to get these planks to land properly, I've got to shave this mold down to a little flat across there. I've got to do that on this plank right here too. And even this one down here needs a little bit of a scratch. This one as well. So it's like the third, fourth, and fifth planks, maybe a hair of the sixth, need a little bit of attention. You can see the same thing is shown here on the transom. We're going to joggle the transom itself to match the inside shape of these planks. So the transom's going to have like this little janky, zigzaggy edge to it. We don't do that on molds. Molds, we just want a smooth curve, but obviously there's some of these in a few spots that need some flats. Now, I stupidly was looking at this drawing and only flattened off the one mold, number 4, not thinking that I should check all the other ones for the same thing, which is just stupid of me. So now I've got to go back and I've got to check all these other molds and I've got to do some flattening. Now, I wish I had noticed this before I assembled the molds, because now I've got to do it on both sides of each mold, which is a big pain in the butt. Well, Ian only showed a few of these molds with planks described on them, and a few of them where the planks were interrupting the shape of the mold. I wasn't thinking. I made those single molds with some flats on them, when obviously I should have been thinking about making all the molds with flats on them at the hard turn of the bilge. It was just complete stupidity on my part that I didn't do that. If we look down here, this is showing how planks normally lap onto each other. There's one plank lapping onto another plank, and this is where we bevel off the planks in order to match. So if we're doing traditional planking, all of our planks need to touch the molds at the lap, not in between. If we were to plank this boat traditionally, and we wanted to use bent frames, we could not use this plank layout. We would have to change up the number of planks we have so that each plank touched off at its edges on the mold, not anywhere in the middle. This is really important. Flats between the laps is a problem. And the reason for that is when you bend a frame into here, if we were to bend a frame into this, right now, that frame would only touch in the center of the planks, it wouldn't touch at the lap, but we need to fasten through a lap. And so we don't want a gap between the lap and the frame. So if we did sawn frames, no problem, because we could saw all those frames to match the faces of these planks, and so that it would be tight at the laps. No problem if it's sawn frames, but if we're using bent frames, traditional riveted planking, we cannot use this same plank layout. We would have to add a couple extra planks in this tight turn of the bilge in order to accommodate this shape. It's easy to think that that would be a good thing to flatten out these molds so the planks lay on them, and if you're doing glued lap strake, it is perfectly fine to do that because we're not relying on frame fastening at the laps. We might do a sawn frame or a glued in frame or whatever. We've got thickened epoxy that we use to make up for gaps and things like that, or we're taking the time to cut something to fit. If you're doing sawn frames in a traditional boat, that's fine. You can go ahead and flatten these off because your sawn frames are going to be cut to match those flats. It only applies to bent frames in a traditional lap strake craft, that you cannot have flats between the laps. Does that make sense? Okay, let's get back to work. So right about now, if you did the same stupid thing I did, you might be freaking out wondering, how am I going to figure out how to do these bevels? How do I get the right bevel on the edges of these molds so that it all works? Don't worry, I got you covered. So check this out. It is a simple little trick. We need to make something called a plank fid. So a plank fid is just a stick that represents your planking. In this case, I'm using 3/8 planks, so I need a fid that's 3/8 wide. The length doesn't matter. Now I need to figure out how these planks are going to land on my molds such that I can bevel them off properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm taking a little end piece here and I'm going to glue that on here, so that gives me a 3/8 depth here. So that's representing how the plank will land on the lap of the adjacent plank. This should look a little more obvious in a minute. A little CA glue going on there. I'm just going to glue those together. So let's go to the drawing and I'll show you how I'm going to use this. I'll show you how it's used on the molds itself. What I would do is I'd use this to represent one of these planks. Now each of these planks has to touch its neighbor up here at this point. That's what this is going to be. This is the depth of the plank. So this plank is going to be full depth where it touches the mold. This is going to be the edge of my new plank, and then I swing this down until it touches where the end of this plank is going to be. Right there. When I go to flatten off my side, I just need to trace this shape right here onto my mold. To try and make that a little bit more clear, this would be one plank, but then we bevel it off. And this represents the beveling. That's why we have a step there, because it's full depth at the edge of the bevel, but then it's going to get shaved off. So we need to be able to approximate that without the other plank in place. So that's what this haunch does. I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but that would represent how the two planks are beveled together. The bevel lying in this little spot right here. If we wanted to figure out what I'm going to do with this junction right here, this is going to be the edge of one lap, and this will be the edge of the other. So I would put this right on there. So that represents one plank coming across here and landing nice and cleanly. And then this is the next one. So we get flattened off like this. Now what I should do is I should make sure that I have accommodated the fact that these in some cases will be flattened off. So if we look at, say, this plank here, it's going to touch off there, and it can easily touch at the edge here without any interference. So that one's good. Same thing, that one's good. This one, we're starting to get real close. I can see that I probably need to shave off just a little hair in here. Okay, so that's going to drop this down just a tiny bit. And so if now I got to accommodate that drop for this next one. And now I connect these dots, and now this much gets shaven off. There's my new lap position. Okay, there's my new lap position there. So, and then this last one looks like it'll pretty much, I just need to take a little shave off this little spot right here and it'll touch just fine. So that's how we figure out how much we need to drop these laps. So in each case, we are accommodating a plank landing at this point and this point, the outside edges of these planks where they're going to get beveled off. So that's all there is to it. Just come in here with the block plane and start shaving these down. I'm working left-handed and backwards for the sake of the camera, which is not very efficient, so I'm going to have to set this up in my vise to do a better job of it, but this is the basic idea. I'll just flatten it down to that line and move on to the next. I got to go over all the molds to do the exact same thing. So you can do it like this too, just working from one to the next. So I've just flattened this one off until I'm touching. That's good. So now I can come to this guy, touching here. So I can just start flattening that off. I can check. Still not touching. Check. Still not touching. What I don't want to do is eat that line. I don't want to eat this plank mark. Closing in on it now. I just ate the mark, which means I got to be real careful. But now I'm just about there. A little bit more to go. It's really hard to avoid eating that mark given my grain direction. Put those marks back. This is why it's important to have them marked on the edge and the face. And now I move on to the next one, do the same thing. Now you could certainly use a belt sander to do this. I suspect you'd overshoot your marks pretty easily with a belt sander. Although I might just mark all these off and then take it over to my stationary belt sander where I can see my lines easily, and I'll probably get the job done a lot faster over there. Alright, so we got all of our molds made. That went pretty fast, so it took me less than a day to do all the cutting and assembly of these molds. I think my pattern method works pretty good for this. I know some people might have the urge to use plywood or some other sheet goods for molds. I can completely understand that. However, I think there's a real advantage to doing it this way. If nothing else, there's cost. So this batch of molds required, essentially, the first one excluded, required like 1 by 8 by 10 feet long and 6 feet of 1 by 6. Altogether, the cost of doing these molds using common lumber, common pine or spruce, was roughly $120 for the whole lot. If you were to do this out of sheet goods, I think you'd have to use at least 4 sheets to get these out. At today's prices around here, that's probably going to be like, you know, a minimum of $160 or something like that, about $40 a sheet for even junky stuff. So that's not particularly cheap. There's also the handling of sheet goods, which is more awkward than long stock. And then there's just cutting out the molds. So if I had to lay it out on plywood, how am I going to cut that? I can sort of rough it out with a circular saw. Maybe I'm using a jigsaw. They're just slow and annoying. Then I still am onto the bandsaw, trying to handle a large panel, which is really difficult on your own and very difficult to be able to see where your lines are at. So trying to cut to the line would be really tough on a big panel like this without having some sort of outboard table support. The other advantage to using solid stock like this is I can put nails in it very easily. I can shave down the molds very easily if I need to do a bit of modification to them. And if I need to clamp onto them, there's at least some voids that I can use to clamp onto. With plywood, I'd have to drill holes or something like that. So there's a lot of reasons I think this is a better way to go. When I'm done with them, I can chuck them outside. These could live in the weather for quite a while with minimal damage to them, compared to plywood, which, depending on the variety you use, might delaminate, or if it's using particle board or something, could fully crumble. Even when I'm done with these, if I'm never going to build the boat again, I'll usually just chop out the broad sections that don't have any fasteners in them, and I'll reuse them for other things in the shop. I can feed them to the wood stove if I want, or hell, I could even compost these easily enough. So I think using solid stock for molds is definitely a superior method over using sheet goods. Of course, if you're doing CNC cutting, maybe that's not the case. However, the plants we have are not digital, or rather, even if I receive them digitally, they're not produced in a way that is immediately usable for CNC cutting. You'd have to do a whole bunch of programming to produce these on a CNC. I don't think it'd be worth it because, as I said, just working with paper plans and solid stock, I got the whole thing done in a day. I don't think you're going to pull that off if you're trying to do it digitally. As you can see, my molds are fairly simple and a little bit rough. Because I only get to build molds maybe once or twice a year at best, I also make a few mistakes along the way. Now, after brief dressing myself down for being a dope, I fix my mistakes, then I move forward. Screwing up is all part of the game. You can't let it get you flustered. It's going to happen. Just try and find creative ways to fix your mistakes. Now, if I were building multiple boats, I'd probably do a nicer job of building these molds. More often than not, I only ever get to build one boat from any particular mold, and so my molds are essentially disposable. Ironically, the boats that I've built with most frequency are skin-on-frame kayaks, and for those I don't use any molds whatsoever. They're just built entirely freeform. And you could do that with any kind of boat, really, but it takes experience and repetition to build freeform effectively. Now, there's a lot of ways to build molds, but this is the way that I've settled on that works best for me. I feel it's efficient in terms of both time and materials, and hopefully it's presented some ideas that are useful to you. But once you start building, you're going to come up with some of your own ideas too, and I encourage you to experiment, because that's the best way to learn. Try one thing, try another thing, see which one of those works best for you, and eventually you're going to come up with ways that you think are superior to the way other people build, and maybe they are. I like making these videos, but they do require time, effort, and some cash resources. So if you can help support these videos, I really appreciate that. And the best way you can do that is by joining me over on Patreon. You can find links in the corner or down in the description. Now, before you jump ship, why don't you watch this video about making bundle battens? All right, folks, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.